sunlight spilled over the quiet suburban neighborhood of Maplewood, casting a warm glow on the immaculate lawns lined with meticulously maintained hedges. This picturesque setting exuded wealth and privilege, where manicured gardens thrived beneath the watchful gazes of many proud homeowners. It was a community of whispers and nods, where reputation meant everything. Reputation built on an illusion of safety and exclusivity. Among these pristine homes, one property stood out: a large, luxurious house for rent. Its freshly painted shutters and inviting front porch belied the darkness that lurked within its owner, Mr. White. Today, a prospect loomed as the Johnson family approached, a beacon of hope in a neighborhood doused in bias. Mr. Johnson, clad in a crisp suit that contrasted sharply with the soft cotton of his wife's dress, held hands with his children, tightly gripping them as they neared the door. Maya, their 10-year-old daughter, twirled on the spot, her braids bouncing enthusiastically, while Jason, her 12-year-old brother, walked slightly ahead, filled with dreams of a backyard where he could set up a basketball hoop. As the Johnsons arrived at the property, their hearts swelled with hope and excitement. For them, this was more than just a house. It represented a fresh start, a space where they could grow as a family and carve out their place in the world. Mr. White's cold eyes met them at the threshold, his smile a stern curve rather than a genuine gesture. It revealed little of the man beneath, the one who wielded power like a weapon, a man who held sway over dreams and aspirations. "Welcome," he said, his voice booming in a way that felt as if he were announcing a performance rather than welcoming potential tenants. "I hope it meets your expectations." With practiced ease, he led them through the home, highlighting each feature with an enthusiasm that felt disingenuous. The Johnsons admired the spacious kitchen, the towering ceilings, and the large backyard that screamed possibilities. They envisioned summer barbecues, late-night conversations under the stars, and laughter filling the air, moments that had been denied to them in their cramped apartment. "Look, Dad, there's so much space," Maya exclaimed, bouncing on her toes. "Yes, it will be perfect for you and Jason to play," Mrs. Johnson said, exchanging a proud glance with her husband. After the tour, they reconvened in the living room, where Mr. Johnson, brimming with optimism, made the first move. "This is exactly what we've been looking for. We're excited to move in as soon as possible," he said, his voice steady yet filled with hope. Mr. White's response was not what they expected. "Before we proceed, I need to review your application, but I'm afraid I can't accept you as tenants." Shock rippled through the Johnson family like a sudden gust of wind that extinguished a flickering flame. "Is there a problem?" Mr. Johnson asked, confusion clouding his brow. "I have to consider what's best for the neighborhood," Mr. White replied, his words deliberate. "I'm looking for the right kind of tenants." He paused, his gaze resting on Maya and Jason. The weight of his unspoken prejudice fell heavily upon them. Mrs. Johnson's heart sank as the veiled insinuation hung in the air, vivid and suffocating. "We are a responsible family," she started, her voice trembling with suppressed anger. "We care deeply about our community." Mr. White's expression hardened. "It's not personal, it's business. I just don't think you'll fit in here." The rejection settled like ash in their hearts. The Johnsons knew they were being judged for the color of their skin. Mr. White was a man of privilege, and he had exercised it without hesitation, erasing their dreams in a matter of moments. As they left the property, an oppressive silence enveloped them. They loaded into their car, each one feeling the sting of humiliation. "Why didn't he want us?" Maya asked softly, the innocence of her question piercing through the simmering sadness in the air. "It's just prejudice, sweetheart," Mr. Johnson replied, his voice imbued with pain, yet steadied by resilience. People sometimes judge based on the color of our skin and not the value we bring. Mrs. Johnson took the children's hands in hers, squeezing gently. It won't always be like this. We will find a way to show them that we belong, she declared, her tone brimming with a fierce determination. That night, as the family gathered around the kitchen table, they discussed their plans. More than a home, they sought to foster a spirit of inclusivity in Maplewood. Mr. Johnson had always been resourceful, and they would harness that resourcefulness to create something meaningful. I won't let our future be dictated by someone else's narrow-minded views, Mr. Johnson asserted, his voice resonant with conviction. This community needs to change. We need to bring families together, not tear them apart. In the weeks that followed, the emotional weight of rejection kept the Johnsons on edge. Yet, within those turbulent waters swirled a strengthening resolve. They visited local community centers, learning about existing programs that supported families in their quest for better living conditions. Each meeting, every firm handshake, and every empathetic conversation inspired their mission. Mr. Johnson worked overtime, pouring extra hours into his job as a project supervisor. He carried the family's dreams on his shoulders, navigating the complexities of construction, codes, and community regulations. His colleagues admired his diligence but sensed something deeper was driving him, a fire that wouldn't extinguish. Meanwhile, Mrs. Johnson took Maya and Jason into the heart of the community. They volunteered at food banks, participated in cleanups, and attended town meetings. It was there, amidst passionate speeches and deliberations, that they began forging connections. They offered their hands to those in need, knowing that community was built on mutual support. However, with every step they took, the rejection from Mr. White haunted them. Maya had trouble sleeping at night, whispers of doubt creeping into her dreams. Jason, too, began to feel the weight of isolation. His friends from school teased him about the lack of a backyard or their cramped living space. One weekend, while tucking Maya in after a long day, Mrs. Johnson gently brushed aside the hair from her daughter's face. "You know, sweetheart, every time life knocks you down, you have to get back up," she said, speaking the words she'd once heard her own mother say when she faced prejudice. "This is just one story in our life. We have many pages left to write. Will we ever find that home we liked?" Maya asked, her big eyes glistening with hope. "We will find our place, and when we do, it will be beautiful," Mrs. Johnson assured her. Mr. Johnson joined them, kneeling close to his children. "Remember, sometimes the biggest obstacles lead to the most profound changes. Our story is not finished yet." On the other side of Maplewood, Mr. White sat back in his opulent leather chair, savoring the accolades from the neighborhood. He proudly rented the property to another family, an affable couple who seemed eager for acceptance within the community. Conversations flowed freely, filled with laughter over backyard barbecues and neighborhood watch meetings. "Things are just as they should be," he declared to neighbors with a smugness that colored his every word. They nodded approvingly, reaffirming their shared sentiments about maintaining the integrity of the area. Little did Mr. White know the winds of change were approaching swiftly. He remained closed off, comfortable in his conformative bubble. Days melted into weeks, and a new project began to emerge. Maplewood was set to undergo a vast revitalization. The idea sparked whispered excitement throughout the neighborhood, but Mr. White dismissed it, unwilling to entertain notions that threatened his perceived order. "This nonsense about affordable housing is nothing but disaster," he scoffed one afternoon, dismissively waving his hand as he spoke with other landlords at a meeting. "These developments ruin property values." His neighbor, Mrs. Harris, leaned closer, her voice conspiratorial. "You know they say this revitalization will change everything. They're even discussing incorporating affordable housing initiatives. Ha! As if I'd allow that on my property, Mr. White retorted, his forehead wrinkling in distaste. I won't have it. I keep my tenants, my neighborhood, exactly as I want it. Days turned into weeks, during which the shadow of outdoor labor began pouring into the community. Demolition crews began tearing down dilapidated buildings, and burger flipping sounds echoed across workers' cheerful greetings. New voices joined the chorus of change, and slowly the waking neighborhood buzzed with enthusiasm. As fate would dictate, the day of reckoning arrived for Mr. White. A letter slipped under his door proclaimed his property would be affected by ongoing city improvements. A mandatory community meeting emerged to present the terms. All landlords were invited to discuss the project, headed by none other than the very man he had rejected, Mr. Johnson. The weight of shame and realization settled over Mr. White like a shroud as he approached the meeting. He'd be standing in front of those same families whose hopes he had so easily dismissed. As he mingled among attendees, his stomach churned with an uneasy sense of dread that bore no familiarity. He was about to witness a change he had refused to embrace. When Mr. Johnson stepped up to the podium, looking calm yet commanding, Mr. White felt the grip of fear tighten around him. There stood the man he denied, embodying the dreams of a thriving community, to grow inclusively while Mr. White's own ego hung in the balance. "Good evening, everyone," Mr. Johnson began, a charismatic smile spreading across his face. "Today marks a turning point for Maplewood. What we are undertaking is not merely about new constructions. It's about fostering growth, a place where everyone can belong." His voice, strong and confident, exuded a warmth that instantly captivated the audience. "Over the next year, we will create a positive living environment by adding affordable housing, new parks, cultural exchange programs, and resources for families striving for better futures," he continued, detailing a vision filled with hope. Applause erupted throughout the room. People leaned forward, nodding along as enthusiasm rippled through them, embracing the chase of dreams with fervor. Mr. White sat stiffly, each clap like a knife cutting deeper into his regrets, as he realized this was not merely about properties or values, but about lives, the lives he had turned away. The meeting concluded with waves of applause, and Mr. Johnson left the podium exhilarated by the response. The conversation swirled around the room, neighbors clapping each other on the back, excitement bubbling as they envisioned a transformed Maplewood with unity at its core. But Mr. White remained frozen in disbelief. What was spurred from prejudice and deep-rooted bias suddenly felt like the prison of his own making. He had wanted to uphold a lifestyle based on elitism, yet now he found himself clinging to a past that simply did not resonate. Embracing diversity seemed inevitable, yet he had allowed his heart to remain closed. "This project will implement new housing standards, and financial penalties will be enforced for landlords with discriminatory practices," a council member stated without hesitation. "This means that property owners who refuse to comply will face repercussions." Suddenly, the room's air buzzed with eager discussions, or perhaps whispers of discontent among those who understood what this meant. Waves of concern washed over Mr. White. He must face a tidal wave of change, and it was one he had evaded for far too long. In the following days, newspapers splashed images of Mr. Johnson alongside headlines proclaiming Maplewood revitalization. Stories about the new initiatives flourished as Mr. Johnson became a community darling, a leader of transformation, while Mr. White sank deeper into his own cycle of denial. As the project began to take shape, the initial ripple of change escalated into a tide, one that swept property values under its current, leaving discrepancies in Mr. White's pristine facade. Panic coursed through him as he watched potential tenants look past his property, flocking instead to renewed spaces, vibrant with community engagement and inclusivity. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, lingering regret morphed into stubbornness that left him feeling shattered. He found himself sulking around town, avoiding conversations with those he once enjoyed, as their very faces now felt foreign in light of their renewed realities. He had alienated himself, allowing Mr. Johnson to claim the ground he should ethically have occupied with humility. Rumors whispered of development meetings, and Mr. White's dismay deepened as his property valuation plummeted. Unable to cope with his dwindling stakes, Mr. White made the hardest decision of all. He sought out Mr. Johnson in a cafe downtown, an echo of desperation faintly shadowing his brow. "Mr. Johnson," he started slowly, gripping the table as if it anchored him, "we need to talk." Mr. Johnson looked up, laden with curiosity yet guarded by a cloak of professional restraint. "What do you want, Mr. White?" I realize how short-sighted I've been," Mr. White admitted, his voice trembling as humility clawed its way out. "I am sorry for how I rejected your family, for the way I treated you." Mr. Johnson studied him, a silence stretching dangerously between them. "Acknowledgement is the first step towards change. I appreciate you admitting that, but we're building something bigger now, our community's future. I understand now that we're at a crossroads." Mr. White nodded, swallowing hard. "The penalties, they could devastate me. I want to sell my property to you. I think I'd be better off letting you lead this development." Mr. Johnson listened patiently, the corners of his mouth turning down ever so slightly. "This isn't about profit for me. You could have created this same space if you had seen what was possible." Mr. White felt defensive. "I was wrong, deeply wrong, but I want to make amends, and you're right about the direction this community needs." In Mr. Johnson's gaze, Mr. White saw a thread of understanding woven through the fabric of resilience. "If you want to sell, we can create a community center to help families in need. That's a start." Mr. White agreed, and the stark reality of his altruism began to anchor him down with purpose. Weeks stretched into months, and with each signing of documents, Mr. White transferred the property to Mr. Johnson, a gesture laden with a promise of rebirth. Under the new ownership, the mansion once enriched with bias transformed into a vibrant community center, where laughter and compassion fluttered through the air unapologetically. Families flocked to the center, engaging in workshops and activities that enriched the community's spirit. Maya and Jason began volunteering, encountering new friendships, and, with their parents' encouragement, blossomed in ways they had never imagined. One balmy Saturday, the newly converted community center hosted its grand opening. The exterior gleamed under the midday sun. Faces poured in with smiles of appreciation, creating a rich mosaic of cultural backgrounds. Mr. Johnson stood at the entrance, holding a pair of scissors, ready to sway the ribbon across the threshold. "Thank you all for coming," he began, addressing the crowd. "Today is about unity, partnership, and resilience. In this space, we will nurture hope and inspire one another as we move forward together." Among the crowd, Mr. White stood behind, watching at first with trepidation, but soon feeling the warmth of community envelope him. Neighbors shuffled, mingled, and exchanged stories, weaving memories that eclipsed the scars of hurt. As the crowd roared with applause, Mr. White caught sight of a familiar face, the same one he had rejected. Mr. Johnson approached him, extending his hand. "Thank you for your journey towards understanding." Overwhelmed with emotion, Mr. White grabbed his hand and shook firmly. "Thank you for allowing me an opportunity to seek redemption. This community, your community, is better for it." With those words, the rebirth of Mr. White echoed against the backdrop of a blooming Maplewood. The seeds of prejudice he could no longer water dwindled far beyond his past, replaced instead with tales, laughter, and a celebration of diversity. As days turned to months, Mr. White transformed into an advocate for equitable housing alongside Mr. Johnson, championing initiatives that rid the community of its long-standing prejudices. Together, they envisioned a brighter future, where all voices were lifted and where everyone, regardless of their background, could embrace the dream of a place to call home. In the heart of Maplewood, the Johnsons stood proudly at the forefront, their story unfolding into new beginnings, a testament to the unbreakable spirit of a family forever intertwined with the legacy of a courageous community that chose to blossom amidst differences, showing how love transcended every past mistake.